Good morning. Happy almost spring. It's starting to feel hopeful that it's actually going to happen, right? So I just want to start by saying I had a meeting this week with some regional pastors, and I don't do that very often, but there was a particular meeting that I was a part of for a variety of different reasons, and listening to these different individuals in different parts of the state and different parts of the country. Actually, there was somebody from Idaho in the meeting, and listening to some of the problems that they're processing and some of the challenges that they have was just a profound reminder to me again of this is the most remarkable group of people, and it is such an honor to be a part of this thing. You know, the money challenges, the facility challenges, lots and lots of things that are just making the gathering, scattering piece really hard for lots of places. And it was just really great to sit there and go, wow, thank you, Lord. We've got some really remarkable people who are really bought into what we're doing here. So thanks for all of that. This morning, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up, we're not going to wrap up. I'm going to wrap up my portion of this series. So if you're completely weirded out and think that I've finally fallen off the deep end and you're not even sure if I follow Jesus anymore, this is the last weekend you have to listen to me talk about this thing called listening therapy, because this is my last shot at it. If you've not been with us, we started this series in early March, and what we're exploring is something called spiritual direction. We're calling it listening therapy. And spiritual direction is likely to be a very new concept to you, but I hope it's reassuring to know that it's not new to the history of the church, especially Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism and other denominations. It's a major part of the way they think about how a person grows in a relationship with God. And so we tend to think about the sermon and the didactic and the book and the teaching, and they do too, and that's a great thing. And then we tend to think, and we've worked really hard around here on the therapeutic and the counseling and the intervention and the sitting across the table from somebody who understands things about your brain and relationships and getting some instruction that way. And that's a great thing. But what spiritual direction points to is a spirit of God who tends to be present constantly, who works in mysterious ways, and sometimes the way we best connect with him is by hearing ourselves talk. You may have caught yourself doing this, and you never even called it spiritual before, but you get about 30 minutes into a tirade or to a presentation and just over dinner with somebody, and suddenly you realize for the first time what it is you've been trying to say. In many ways, that's what spiritual direction is it's a bit of a misnomer, because direction, it's not direction in the sense of a director and a directee sitting in a space together with a directee having all the answers and giving them, a director having all the answers, giving them to the directee. It's not like that at all. What spiritual direction involves, frankly, is a director and a directee sharing space together, and mostly what happens is the directee, the client, if you will, they just start talking. And the goal is to get you just talking about where the heat is, where the stress is, where the joy is, where the pain is, whatever it is that comes first and foremost in your mind. Like, the goal is to get you talking about and communicating on those topics. And the belief is that in the process of being heard, in the process of having an expert sitting across from you who's really good at asking questions, using your own language to ask those questions, to having a person sitting across the table from you who can restate things using your words, not their own. Because again, a major difference between this and any kind of therapy is that the director, if they're doing their job, they don't have an end in mind. They would say that they've ceased to listen the minute they do. That they're not there to fix you, they're just there to attend to what God is doing and to help you ultimately understand God's presence in your life, and ultimately so awareness and then discernment, what it looks like to follow God. So this morning's my last shot at this. Next week, though, you don't want to miss next week, because next week, one of my instructors from Portland Seminary, her name is Lynn Holt. She's a former Quaker pastor who is now a full-time she's a full-time spiritual director in the Portland area. She's a remarkable woman. She also teaches in the spiritual director's program, and she's a very authoritative voice in this whole deal. So she's going to be here next weekend. Please don't miss that as she wraps up this series. She's also going to be in town for a couple of days and helping us begin to lay the groundwork for what does it look like if 10 years from now we got to play a instrumental part in making sure that long after we're gone, and potentially long after Narrate's gone, that spiritual directors are an institution just like doctors and dentists and, well, those are the same thing. Sorry, Christian. I didn't mean it like that. But, like therapists and teachers and everything else. Like, I feel like our community lacks this presence, and so we're going to start laying that groundwork that way. So, what happened this week was, so some of you will know, like my routine is I prepare for these series in advance. I create Evernote entries for notes that I can return to on Tuesday. I have a giant whiteboard in my office. I start mind mapping Tuesday morning. And for me, the win is if I can have most of what I think is worth saying on a whiteboard by noon on Tuesday, then I have the rest of the week to kind of work it out. So I actually got ahead this week. By 11 o'clock, I had everything on the whiteboard. I was feeling really good. It was this what I felt like was going to be a good conversation about prayer and spiritual direction. And then I took a break, went and refilled my coffee mug, hit the bathroom, came back, and had this thought of like, wait a minute, I think I'm going to scratch all that. And the question that occurred to me was, what would be the practical takeaways for those of us who are just too weirded out by this? I mean, what would be the practical value of this in the everyday? And listen, I hope you see a director at some point, and if you're interested, please contact me. I don't know of any in Helena. I'm told there's some in other places. Directions, like lots of other professions, there's lots of different types who have lots of different claims, and I frankly have some strong opinions about it, about what the right way to do it is. I can help you network to places like Portland and Oregon and Washington if you're interested. But all that aside, if you never see a spiritual director, here's what I want to try to tackle is what's the value of this? What can we take away from this and our interaction with the holy, with our pursuit of God, and also in our interaction with one another? So 4 things, and a little bit, I suppose, linear this morning, but I just want to kind of wrestle with 4 things as we try to wrap up. Okay, what am I doing with this? The first one is this. I think it invites us to rethink. I think I put rethinking what it means to be judgmental. There's a loaded word. I mean, if someone were to ask your opinion, and I'm sure you would have one, what does it mean to be judgmental? I suppose we all have one, and it's probably something around the idea, or at least our cultural ideas seem to be that to be judgmental is to hold a view that's not necessarily kind towards others. That would be one opinion. I suppose another iteration of that would be to hold a view and to not hold it in such a way that's tactful or tasteful or empathetic towards others. Probably all of us would think of bigots on street corners without any awareness of context or who the audience is, just kind of shouting things. Jesus even had opinions on what it meant to be judgmental in Matthew 7. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you'll be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Which is interesting that Jesus' conversation about judgmentalism, it starts with you in the sense of be careful, because the voices in your head that talk about others will talk about you the same way, which is kind of a scary thought, right? Like if we're trying to get out under our own self-talk, the reality is, it seems like Jesus is saying, you'll talk about yourself the same way you talk about others. So if you want to solve one problem, you got to solve the other, which kind of becomes a chicken and the egg conversation. But he keeps going. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plant in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So eye surgery in the ancient world was a big deal. It's dangerous. The implications of being blind were no different than they are today, I suppose. But here's where I think spiritual direction can help us rethink, because obviously what Jesus is doing is he's pointing to blame. He's pointing to condemnation. But I wonder if he would actually agree that modern brain science, and this is speculative, further unpacks what it means to be judgmental. Here's what I mean by that is, so in the world of spiritual direction, one of the things directors do, if they're practicing it ethically, is they're also sitting under supervision. So just think of it as like kind of expert criticism. So a director, in the process of directing, part of what makes it difficult is this thing called counter-transference. Is you listen to somebody says something. It just happened to me in a direction session this week. Somebody says something, and suddenly you have a realization. Suddenly you're suddenly thinking about your childhood. You're suddenly thinking about your week last week. You're suddenly thinking about some other situation in your life, and this is where it gets tricky. And countertransference is, now you start talking about your experience, telling yourself that you're helping them. So, oh yeah, you went through a divorce, let me tell you about mine. And what you're telling yourself is you're helping them process theirs by talking about yours, but really what you're doing is taking care of yourself in that moment. Does that make sense? And that's, for me, that's the hardest part of listening, right? Is we immediately jump in and talk about ourselves. So in a spiritual direction session, part of what directors are trained is that the way you avoid that, and therapists are trained this, and lots of different expertise are trained this, but spiritual directors are trained that the way you deal with that is you go to supervision. And a supervisor, Lynn is actually a supervisor, supervision is a director with even more training than yours, but the only purpose of that time, from a director to a supervisor, is to have noted what were the things that triggered in your sessions so that you can process them with that person. So, because I'm in this class and doing this work, we're doing supervision as well. I was doing supervision with Lynn about a month, or maybe it was even 2 months ago. And we're talking through that, and part of what I started sharing with her was, I was like, here's what I don't understand, Lynn, is spiritual direction is exhausting. Like, it's an hour-long session, and listen, I've met with people for an hour for 20 years. It's what I've done with my adult life. I do a noon, and on most days a 3 o'clock and a 4 o'clock meeting 4 days a week. What's caught me off guard is I leave a session, and I am wiped. In fact, this week I had sessions on consecutive days, and I was like the meanest person on the planet by the end of the second day, and I couldn't figure out why until I was like, the direction thing wipes me out. So I was asking Lynn, why am I so tired? I do this all the time. Why does a direction session wear me out? And she said, she started talking about brain science. She started talking about the executive functioning centers of the brain, and some of it were reminders, and some of it was new information, but essentially what she said is, Adam, remember, your brain is at its core judgmental. And what she means by that is your brain, and there's lots of resources that point in this direction, your brain is lazy. The reason you can drive from here home and not remember driving from here to home is your brain loves to take familiar information and plug it in to current problems. So you have a bad experience with red, and for the rest of your life, red is bad. Your brain just decides that for you before you think about it. You have a good experience with blue, and for the rest of your life, blue is good. You have a bad experience with somebody who's holding a Bible, and for the rest of your life, people who hold the Bible are bad. You have a bad experience with a white male or a Native American, and you see how this goes. So she said, Adam, remember, your brain it's judgmental, and it's lazy. And so part of what happens when you're trying to listen to somebody else is as they're talking, your brain is trying to turn around to the card catalog that you've assembled. This is why one of the themes that I've noticed is those of you especially who have like 5 years or more in separation in your marriage, it's extremely difficult. Why? Because your brain you've assembled these big card catalogs of solutions to problems, and so when you hear someone talk about theirs, you just pull yours out and you throw it on the table. Problem solved. And so what she was explaining is that what a director is doing is constantly telling their brain no. It's part of what it means to listen, to not jump to conclusions, to not fill in the blank, but to attend to. And so she said, basically, Adam, it's physiology. That if you spend an hour doing your job as a director and really listening to somebody, you are physiologically exponentially more tired than any other kind of meeting because your brain, it's like you have the pedal to the floor for the full hour versus being an idle. Which gets me thinking, what if one aspect of what it means to be judgmental is that we fill in blanks, that we jump to conclusions? Now, can we live this way constantly? No more than you can sprint everywhere you go. But I wonder if part of the value of all this spiritual direction conversation, if nothing else, is a conversation between you and God's Spirit, you and yourself if you're not comfortable with that, where you just open yourself up to having these moments in a day where you can be prompted to go, wait, shut up. Like, nobody cares what you know right now. The goal right now is just listen, just be present. Don't fill in blanks. Don't feel like you know what they're going to say next. Don't feel like they're asking you to solve your problem. I wonder what happens if we start thinking about it in those terms, which is interesting, and the reason why I feel comfortable with this suggestion is listen to what Jesus says next. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. What the heck? Well, it's an idiom, and you probably already know this. Idioms, of course, like if someone was to transcribe you of saying, like, I was so hungry I could eat a horse, and then 1,000 years from now, someone was trying to translate that, they could get themselves in some real trouble by taking those words literally. And yet, why wouldn't they? Because what they know is eating, and so the conclusion would be when you get really hungry, you eat horse, which I think also makes you a criminal, doesn't it? This is an idiom. And here's where we have to trust students of the culture and the context, and Dallas Willard being one of those. What they tell us is the idiom here is, don't give your unwanted answers to people, or else they'll just devour them and they'll hate you twice as much when they're done. So interesting, isn't it, that Jesus starts a conversation about being judgmental and he transitions to, just don't give people advice that they're not asking for. What if to be judgmental is, in some sense, to fail to listen? And it all goes downhill from there. And then listen to what Jesus says next, because I think this also transitions into rethinking why we pray. Listen to what Jesus says next. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you'll find. Knock and the door will be opened. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Dallas Willard points out that long before this was pointed directly at you and your prayer life and God, it was pointed to the same context as judgmentalism. In other words, don't condemn, don't blame, don't give people unwanted answers. Just shoot straight with them and tell them what it is that you need. Now, I don't know why you struggle with prayer, or maybe you don't struggle to pray. I'm very fond of you if you don't. I've struggled for a long time, and I think what I'm realizing is part of where I struggle is, if God can read my mind, then why does he need me to say it to him, right? Like if God is like the federal government in our cell phone, and he can just why doesn't he just monitor every thought that I have and make his own determination about whether or not it's a good thought or a bad thought? And I mean, I'm perfectly comfortable, God, just filtering my thoughts, aren't you? And just concluding with his own sovereignty what he's going to do with those thoughts. Here's where I think spiritual direction can challenge us, because what if relationship happens when two people pay attention to one another? It breaks down when only one of the two is paying attention to the other. And therefore, what if part of the purpose of prayer isn't just getting things? What if part of what Jesus is getting at here is he doesn't need your pomp and circumstance and your ceremonies and your religiosity and blah, blah, blah. Just say what it is you're thinking. What if spiritual direction invites us to begin to learn to point prayer in the direction of where the hot spots are? One theory is this, that if you're struggling to pray, it's that you're struggling to really ask, seek, and knock. That you're struggling to really talk to God about the stuff that really matters to you. That for whatever reason, you're couching things, you're holding things back. And I think part of what I know, here's what happens to me, I don't know if it happens to you, but maybe this will help, is I'll listen to people pray. And this is why I don't do regional conferences with pastors, because I don't feel Christian when I'm done. Because they pray about souls and people getting saved and kids in Africa. And to be honest with you, intellectually, I know those should be the first things that come to mind for me, but they're not. I'm like, wow, that's really kind, because I'm thinking about like the Cardinals and whether or not they can win today, and little stuff like, will there be 8 feet of snow on an egg scramble run that we're doing? Do you have this happen? And so you just disqualify yourself. What if prayer is by definition just talking to God about what matters? Listen to the way, these are a couple real authoritative spiritual directors. This piece jumped off to me. Go ahead to that next slide. It says, the director who's become accustomed to the fact that very often difficulties in prayer are due to the suppression of important attitudes and feelings. So see what he's saying there? Does not quickly encourage directees to accept at face value statements like, I had no time for prayer, or I prayed only on the run. The director tends to ask, what was happening the last time prayer was alive? What if part of what direction reminds us of is God wants relationship, and relationship starts by paying attention to another, and thus a function of prayer. And the reason why Jesus did it wasn't because he had a religious box to check off, but because Jesus just talked to God about life and had space to listen in turn. Something to think about. Third thing, I think spiritual direction also challenges us to rethink why we pray. To rethinking relational engagement. Now, this one's a little bit disconnected, but I told you this was a little bit mechanical this morning. Here's what this involves. How often do you go like, man, I really like them, and man, I'd really like to connect with them, and then you have dinner, or you have coffee, or you have a beer, or you do whatever it is you do, and then you leave and you go, man, we didn't talk about anything. And that's kind of a bummer because I got this stuff that's bugging me. And that's kind of a bummer because I know they got this stuff that's bugging them. Like they've got a parent with cancer and suddenly that's going on, or I know they're not doing great in their marriage. And how many of you just go like, I wonder, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I wonder how many of us have just given up on real relational connection because we can't get through that. Here's where I think spiritual direction can help. And we've talked a little bit about this in the past, but a sibling, if you will, of spiritual direction is something easily applied to kind of a small group environment. And it looks like this. Dr. Bruner, you may remember we talked about this about a year ago. He called them triads. But it looks like this. 3 or 4 people, they agree that they're going to share space, whether that's lunch or more formal in a conference room somewhere or whatever, once a week or once every couple weeks or once a month, whatever that looks like, the classic small group thing. But here's how they break through, and here's how this mechanism is used to push into the real depth of life. What happens is one person pulls out their iPhone, and they set a timer to 5 minutes. Or 7.5 minutes. I mean, he's kind of doing the math of how long you want to be here. Dr. Bruner's in one. They meet, I forget how often, once a month or so, and I think they go 15 minutes. So here's what happens is you set a timer, you hit start, and one person, let's just say it's me, it's the floor is theirs. And it's just talk. It's kind of mini spiritual direction. Nobody else gets to interrupt. Nobody else gets to ask questions. It's just your spot to say. And part of what I love about spiritual direction is it doesn't even have to be orthodoxically accurate. It doesn't have to be kind. It doesn't have to be true. You just get to speak in confidentiality. Eventually the timer goes off. And then in classic applications, there's a deep breath, a minute-long kind of silence, and another 5-minute timer, or 15, or whatever it is you're doing. Now, it's the other people in the space's opportunity to ask you questions, to issue clarifying statements. Again, we don't help you with your marriage problems by talking about ours. That's not the design of this. It's all about you. And the fundamental belief is in the 10 minutes combined, you're going to meet with God. And then the timer goes off, and boom, we do it with the next person. And then timers go off, and you do it with the next person. And if you're a relationally inept introvert like me, this is the perfect structure. Or if you're that person who just is, there's people in your life that you would love to process the real stuff with, but you just can't get through the superficial stuff, maybe this would help you. And it's really, as Larry Crabb talks about, if we were doing this, I don't even know if we would need spiritual directors, and because it would just be communities of people taking care of one another, not by solving problems, but by creating space to be heard. Last thing I think this invites us to think about is chair time. And when I say chair time, it's kind of, I suppose, insider language to talk about devotion time, that opportunity in a day or a week or a month to come up next to God. Listen to what Ecclesiastes says. Where is which is like the hardest book in the Bible to find. Ecclesiastes 5. I spent about a week here earlier. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know what they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God's in heaven and you're on earth. So let your words be few. What stands out to me is that whoever it is that wrote Ecclesiastes, and there's great debate on that, somehow their understanding of temple was that you expect to meet with God in that space. Now, we spent a lot of time in August talking about what temple does and doesn't mean, I think, under Jesus. But I wonder if spiritual direction reminds us that God is present, that he is attentive, that he is there, and that part of the invitation is not only to discover an awareness of him through things like triads and small group meetings and spiritual direction sessions, but also to show up in certain spaces, expecting to gain an awareness of and the ability to discern how to follow God. There's a story in the Old Testament, and I've alluded to it earlier, but when Moses went to start his revolution, it's funny to me, like, had it worked, it would have been a revolution. Because it didn't work, it was murder, right? Like he's a Hebrew. He decides that they're treated poorly. He decides he's going to lead them the heck out of Egypt. He goes to try to do that. It doesn't work out. It turns out to be murder. But here's the question. What was the plan? Where was he going to take them if it did work? Or what was his plan for himself when it didn't work? Because clearly it didn't, and he had to go running. But here's my question. Was he Forrest Gump? Like just running, like doesn't matter where I'm going, I'm just getting the heck out of Egypt? Or did he have intention with where he was going? If you read the Archaeology Study Bible, they have some strong opinions on that. And part of it is because he ended up in Midian. He met some girls, ended up a part of a community called the Midianites, which we now know through archaeology were very Jewish in their thinking about God. And they lived around the base of a mountain called Horeb. We know it as Sinai. And we also know that the way people thought about the gods in this era was that gods possessed mountains. So different gods lived on tops of different mountains. And guess where the Jewish God was thought to have lived? On top of Horeb. Which means that if we're not careful, we talk about Moses and an experience as the burning bush as though he, like, as my grandpa would say, like started, stumbled, farted, and fell on top of this place where God was. Like, boom. Didn't know that was coming. Or he pointed himself in a direction where he knew he was going to meet with God. For me, it's challenged the way I think about my morning chair time. Like, am I just showing up, or am I expecting to have an encounter with the Holy? I think it could invite you to think differently about the value of Sundays. And listen, if you don't meet with God here, there are a lot of good churches in town. Please go find them. I hope they're a church that cares deeply about you and also about reaching de-churched people. But go find one. I think there's value in even knowing, like, what are your monthly and even quarterly and even annual rhythms where you just know I need these kinds of things, but we show up expecting to meet with God. Spiritual direction is a little bit weird, a little bit out of context, but I also wonder if the ancientness of it is a good complement to our own version of modernity in challenging us to not just have this intellectual thing with God, but this personal encounter. So, at the risk of creating some kind of religious treadmill, we're going to take communion this morning. We'll have elements here, and up there. Remember, we dip, we don't sip for lots of reasons, but mostly because we don't like germs. We also don't dip knuckles. We try to avoid skin contact with all things liquid. So, if you need a set of pliers or something, let me know, and the ushers will get you a set of pliers. But we're trying to avoid all physical contact with the holy beverage. I'd like to pray. God, thank you, Lord, that though we often play fast and loose with you and just can become so guilty of only seeing what we can see right in front of us and only believing in what we can touch and feel, thanks, God, that your Spirit is present, alive, and well. Thanks, Lord, that you show up in the forms of other people, that you give us the chance to show up by being attuned listeners. And God, thanks that we don't always have to have everything perfectly formed or stated. It doesn't even have to be accurate. It doesn't even have to be kind, that we can just begin to process. God, thanks for this community that you've assembled, and though we like to keep it loose, would you also stay forefront in the way that we're processing what it means to be a community together. We love you, God. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.